there was an attempt to have migrations, including one of your ancestors, uh, from the Red River area up in what is now Manitoba. This is about 1841. Yeah, 1841. And the problem was that there was a lot of people involved in the decision to bring the settlers down. Unfortunately, the people actually in this area, like John McLaughlin at Fort Vancouver, or it wasn't Tolma yet, it was Angus MacDonald at Fort Nisqually, they were not involved. They were not prepared. And so when the settlers came down, there was misunderstandings, promises were made and unfulfilled. It just didn't work out. Now the question is, what are the Red River settlers, where exactly did they settle? And that's like the million-dollar question. Because some people believe they settled as far south as Olympia even. No one knows for sure. The records are not that good. I mean, the best records we have are the records of the settlers coming into the post and what supplies they bought at Fort Nisqually. We don't know specifically who settled at the Stilican farm site. So when Joseph Thomas Heath came later and he took over the Red River settlers, we don't know what place he took. So anyway, the Red River settlers, it lasted a couple, things are always more complicated. The part up here lasted for a couple of years. People were disappointed. They went down the Willamette Valley. Why suffer under difficult conditions when there was basically free land down there? Now, your ancestor came back to this area later.
Later.
Yeah, 1850s, 1860s. But anyway, so the Flets did come back. Most of the other people stayed down in Oregon. Now, later, there were two individuals that came out. Joseph Thomas Heath and John Ross, and they became farmers. They worked with the company. It was a different operation. Ross was the son of a major Hudson's Bay Company employee up at Fort Victoria, and Heath was an interesting character who was basically bankrupt his family back in England. He came out here to redeem himself and to gain back his fortune. He was actually a very good farmer. And so he came out here and under severe conditions established a farm at Stilican. He was fairly successful. It was a tough go, and then he died 4.5 years after coming here. And so when the U.S. military came in and they wanted a place to have a post, they looked around this area. They saw this Stilican farm that had a series of buildings already established and crops too, probably. And they said, well, we'll take this area. And so they rented it from the Hudson's Bay Company, I think for $50 a year or something like that, very minimal. So the thing is, the Red River settlers were a dramatic part of the history, but it did not come out the way the HBC or the PSAC wanted it to go. The fur trade companies, they were very much a strict hierarchy. They were used to saying to the employees, or who were referred to as servants, they said, yes, we want you to do this and this. When free settlers come in, like the Red River settlers, it just didn't work. It was two ways of thinking, two different systems of operation. Anyway, questions? Yeah.
Why were there so many Hawaiians?
Okay. I'm particularly interested in the Hawaiian connection. And I guess it dates back to the time I worked at the State Capitol Museum for some time. And in the collection was a poi pounder. I thought, well, this is nice. It must have come from Hawaii. Well, it actually came from the Lacey area, from Chambers Prairie. So I thought, well, why would there be a poi pounder there? Well, the reason is Hawaii was discovered from the Euro-American viewpoint by Captain Cook in the late 18th century. From the very beginning, it was a prize area for ships to stop at, for supplies, for food, and so at that time, a lot of the ships needed labor. Sailors would die, desert, and so they would hire Hawaiians. And at that time, life was very difficult in Hawaii. Particularly, I mean, there was a very strict hierarchy of chiefs, commoners, and slaves. And for many people, there was no real future there. And so they hired on with ships, and eventually they hired on with the Hudson's Bay Company. They were a cheap economic labor that the company hired, and at times there were hundreds of Hawaiians over here. And they were very hardworking people, and they accomplished a lot. And interestingly, many of them married in with Native Americans, and there's descendants locally on the Nisqually Reservation, the Kalama family, for example. And now the sad thing is, a number of them did move up to British Columbia after this became American territory, because under American law, they were considered black and couldn't receive land or right to vote. Up in Canada, the British considered them citizens, and so they had more rights up there. So anyway, they were cheap economical labor. They came over. They played a crucial role in the development of this area.
Having to do with the Heath farm, in the
Yeah.
Heath diary, he mentions a slave that was working on his farm.
Yes.
Now, would that have been an Indian slave?
Okay.
Since the Indians were at war and captured one, then the Indian became a slave?
There's a long history of slavery in the Northwest Coast, Native American society. And when the Hudson's Bay Company came, they were both individually and corporately took a stand against slavery. But because of the fact that they had to work, they needed to work, they wanted to work with Native Americans, they were not abolitionists. Okay? They did not come to abolish slavery over here. And so many of the people that worked, let's say someone married a Native American, their family, they would have slaves. They were Native American. There were some black slaves up here in Washington Territory, but very few. I think one of the things is interesting is that most of the whites that came out here, one reason was to get away from the conflict. And there was a general pro-South view among the American settlers out here. But no, it wasn't really black slaves, it would be Native American slaves.
How long did the fort last there in DuPont?
Okay. The third...
Because I have something interesting to tell.
Oh, okay. The third post was created in 1843. Okay. It lasted in 1869. The U.S. government bought the rights of the Hudson Bay Company. Edward Huggins took the area, homesteaded it, and so he lived there. So officially the fort ended in 1869. Huggins lived there for decades. He finally moved to Tacoma, I believe.
It was my mother's grandfather.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Edward Huggins?
No, I mean, let's see, my aunt married a Huggins, and it was her grandfather that was there.
Oh, okay.
And my mother mentioned in her diary the Ptolemies. Now, did the Ptolemies come back to the fort? Was there another Ptolemy?
Okay.
She said that he used to bounce her on his knees. And that was so interesting.
Well, the thing is, I
In the
believe...
fort there.
Yeah, I believe, okay, Dr. Ptolemy left Fort Nisqually in 1859. He went to Victoria. He was promoted.
Mhm.
And he was in the Hudson's Bay Company for more years. He retired. He had a very large estate up in Victoria. He died up there. He was very active in politics and different things. He often came down to Nisqually. Between the different officers, like the Huggins family and the Ptolemy family, there were social ties. I mean, he would come visit. I think their wives were even related. They might have been sisters. Yeah, the two wives were. And so there would have been good reason for the Ptolemies to come down.
Yes. That would be after 1889.
Okay. Now, one of Ptolemy's sons became one of the prime minister of British Columbia, and so there was continuing ties between the area.
My mother was born in 1889, and she was a little girl when she was there at the fort.
Yeah.
And that's one thing
Yeah.
she said in her diary, that Tom bounced.
Yeah. Well, he's a very interesting person. And when you read about Dr. Ptolemy, he seems like such a serious person. But one of the stories I've read across is Dr. Ptolemy was very scientific. He was a medical doctor, he was a linguist, but he also sometimes fell for fads. And so he, at one period in life, kind of half fell for seances. And so at Fort Nisqually, they would have seances once in a while, talk to the dead. But I guess it wasn't successful. Yeah.
Is the department store in Canada, Hudson's Bay Company, a descendant of?
Yeah.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, it is. It's a direct descendant of the company. It's the same company. There was a massive changeover of the company around 1869, 1870. The whole emphasis changed. They became more into selling land, the land holdings, and department stores. Up until quite recently, though, probably into the 60s, they still had fur trading operations way up north near the Arctic, in northern Canada. But it is the same company, and they're very proud of it. Too. I think it's the oldest company, at least in North America.
How about the Brown Farm at the Nisqually Wildlife Refuge?
Okay, the Brown Farm is a much more recent thing. That would be in the Nisqually Delta area, and I think it was around the turn of the century that A.L. Brown, I think is his name, came down and from Seattle. He set up a model farm, and he tried to use the most effective equipment and had crops and dairy cows and beef and we know a lot about it because a friend of his was Asher Curtis, a photographer, and he took extensive photographs of the farm. And one of the things they did was work on that dike that kind of established what Nisqually Delta looks like now by setting up that dike. Unfortunately, during World War I period, they reached financial difficulties, and he had to sell out. And so the name was continued as Brown Farm, I think, into the 20s and 30s, but it was different ownership. So it is a very important for the history of the Delta.
And they have a lot of buildings and everything.
There are a couple of
the
buildings.
orchards still going?
Some of the orchards, the buildings, only a few. The most famous are the twin farms, the twin barns. And those, I think, date from about 1934, so a little bit later than the Brown itself, but still it was called Brown Farm.
Yeah, they refer to it as the Brown Farm.
I have a question going down to Thurston County. You mentioned near Rainier, but then you also mentioned New Market. Now, am I getting, Rainier and New Market are a long ways apart, are they not?
Okay, Rainier is it's a town now,
Right.
little town of Rainier.
So is the grave at closer to Rainier?
Yeah.
Or is it
Okay.
closer to New Market?
Okay, New Market is Tumwater.
Right, okay.
And the Tennequock Farm is closer to Rainier, and the graveside of Linkletter, Thomas Linkletter and Mary Linkletter on the farm itself at Tennequock. So that would be closer to Rainier.
Closer to Rainier. And when you said Clear Lake, but it's now
McIntosh. Right?
McIntosh.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Has there been any discoveries of the Heath buildings?
Okay, that's a good question. I know there's been archaeological work done at Fort Steilacoom site, and I haven't read the reports. I know that they found extensive Fort Steilacoom remains. There's still a number of buildings there.
Yeah.
But with the Washington State Hospital, Fort Steilacoom, I don't know how much would remain, because it was the same place. So as far as I know, no, they haven't found. The best archaeological remains I've seen are at the 1843 fort, the 1833 fort, and what's called Nisqually Village, which is right outside the 1843 fort. And there's one thing I like to mention that reminds me, is that there is a discussion going on now about the future of the Nisqually DuPont area, the cultural resources, the heritage there. And some of you might have read it in the paper and stuff. This whole area was now Northwest Landing, part of DuPont, has a very extensive history dating back to prehistoric times, Hudson's Bay Company, American settlers, the Buffalo Soldiers maneuvered there about 1906, the Old Town, DuPont, whole DuPont history. The area is now owned by the Warehouse Real Estate Company. They have extensive plans for that area. Much of the area has received toxic waste from the DuPont company, and in the environmental impact statement that has come out, the draft, Warehouse Company proposes to basically level the area, cut all the trees down, and to dig down and remove